Moving into a new home is supposed to be one of the most exciting moments in anyone's life. For Alex, it was no different. After years of saving up, working hard, and dreaming about having their own space, they finally found the perfect house, a modest yet charming little place with just enough room for all their belongings and maybe even some future memories. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with tree-lined streets and friendly-looking neighbors waving as they drove by during their first visit. Everything felt right. It was time to start fresh. On the big day, Alex woke up early, buzzing with excitement and nerves. Their friends had promised to help with the move, so there was already a sense of camaraderie in the air. By mid-morning, the moving truck arrived, packed to the brim with boxes, furniture, and everything else that made Alex's old apartment feel like home. As they began unloading, laughter filled the driveway. Friends joked around, teasing each other while carrying awkwardly shaped pieces of furniture. The sun was shining, birds chirped cheerfully, and for once, everything seemed to be going smoothly. But then out of nowhere, trouble showed up, and her name was Karen. Karen wasn't exactly subtle when she appeared on the scene. She strode onto Alex's driveway like she owned not just the street but the entire neighborhood. Her posture was rigid, her lips pursed tightly, and she carried a clipboard under her arm as though it were some kind of badge of authority. At first glance, she looked harmless enough, just another neighbor stopping by to welcome the newcomer. But anyone who'd ever dealt with someone like Karen before would recognize the signs immediately. This wasn't going to be a casual hello. Without so much as introducing herself or offering congratulations on the new home, Karen launched straight into what can only be described as an interrogation. "Are you aware?" she began sharply, pointing at the moving truck parked near the curb, "that vehicles are not allowed to block public pathways? This is clearly stated in our community guidelines." Alex blinked, taken aback by her tone. They hadn't even finished unpacking yet, let alone read through whatever guidelines Karen was referring to. Still, they tried to stay polite. "Oh, I'm sorry," Alex replied, forcing a smile. "We'll move the truck as soon as we're done unloading. Thanks for letting us know." But Karen wasn't satisfied, not by a long shot. She glanced toward the open front door, where a couch was halfway inside, and frowned deeply. "And what about that?" she demanded, gesturing dramatically. "You can't just leave furniture sitting there. It looks messy and it obstructs the view from the street. Our neighborhood prides itself on maintaining a certain aesthetic." At this point, Alex's patience was starting to wear thin. Who was this woman anyway? Why did she care so much about how things looked before Alex had even settled in? "I appreciate your concern," Alex said carefully, trying to keep their voice steady. "But we're literally in the middle of moving. Once everything's inside, I promise it'll look much better." Karen didn't seem convinced. Instead, she continued scanning the area, searching for anything else she could nitpick. When her eyes landed on a red box sitting innocently by the doorway, she gasped audibly. "That color!" she exclaimed, pointing accusingly. "It clashes horribly with the rest of the neighborhood. We have standards here, you know." By now, Alex's friends were exchanging glances, stifling giggles behind their hands. One of them whispered jokingly, "Wow, I didn't realize we were living in a design magazine." Another muttered, "Is she serious right now?" But Alex knew better than to laugh. If they wanted to avoid escalating the situation, they needed to handle Karen with care, or at least try to. "I'll make sure to repaint the box later," Alex joked lightly, hoping humor might diffuse the tension. Unfortunately, Karen wasn't amused. In fact, her expression grew even more sour, if that was possible. She crossed her arms over her chest and tapped her foot impatiently. "This isn't funny," she snapped. "If you don't take these issues seriously, I'll have no choice but to report you." "Report them? For what? Moving in?" Alex couldn't believe what they were hearing. They opened their mouth to respond, but before they could say anything, Karen whipped out her phone and started dialing. That's when Alex realized, with growing dread, that she wasn't bluffing. She really was calling someone. And judging by the way she held the phone to her ear, tapping her foot faster and faster, it was clear she meant business. "Who are you calling?" Alex asked, unable to hide the frustration creeping into their voice. The authorities. Karen replied matter-of-factly, as though summoning law enforcement to someone's home was the most normal thing in the world. They need to know about this. The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. Authorities? What did that even mean? Were they really about to get in trouble for something as trivial as parking a moving truck near the curb or leaving a couch halfway inside the house? It all felt surreal, like some bizarre sitcom episode playing out in real life. As Karen spoke into the phone, her voice clipped and authoritative, Alex turned to their friends for support. "Can you believe this?" they whispered, shaking their head in disbelief. Their friends shrugged, equally baffled. "Maybe she's just trying to scare you," one suggested. "Yeah, maybe," Alex muttered, though deep down they weren't so sure. A short while later, 2 police officers pulled up in front of the house. Blue lights flashed briefly as they parked, drawing curious stares from passers-by. Neighbors peeked out of their windows wondering what the commotion was about. Meanwhile, Alex's stomach churned with anxiety. What if Karen had convinced the cops that they were some sort of menace to society? Would they really get in trouble for moving? When the officers stepped out of their car, Karen greeted them with the same smug confidence she'd shown earlier. She launched into a detailed explanation of the violations she claimed to have witnessed, using phrases like excessive noise and obstructing public pathways. Alex listened silently, their mind racing. How had such a simple, ordinary day spiraled so quickly out of control? Thankfully, the officers weren't as quick to judge as Karen seemed to hope. After listening to her rant, they turned to Alex and asked calmly, "What's your side of the story?" Alex took a deep breath and explained the situation as best they could, showing proof of purchase for the house and assuring the officers that they planned to address any concerns once they were fully moved in. After verifying the details, the cops gave Alex a reassuring nod. "Looks like everything's fine here," one of them said firmly, shooting Karen a pointed look. "Just try to keep things orderly, okay?" With that, the officers got back into their car and drove away, leaving Karen standing awkwardly in the driveway. For a moment, she looked almost embarrassed, but only for a moment. As soon as the coast was clear, her usual haughty demeanor returned. She glared at Alex, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Don't think this is over," she hissed before turning on her heel and marching off. Alex watched her go, feeling a mix of relief and anger. Relief because the immediate crisis had passed, and anger because they couldn't believe someone would go to such lengths over something so petty. Little did Karen know, however, that this encounter was far from the end of their story. In fact, it was only the beginning. The sound of the police car driving away was both a relief and a wake-up call for Alex. On one hand, they were grateful that the officers had seen through Karen's over-the-top accusations and dismissed them without much fuss. On the other hand, the whole situation left a bitter taste in their mouth. Moving into a new home was supposed to be a joyful experience, not something that involved law enforcement before the first box was even unpacked. As Alex stood there on the driveway, surrounded by half-unloaded furniture and curious glances from neighbors, they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't going to be an isolated incident. If Karen was willing to call the cops over misplaced furniture and a red box, what else might she do? Karen didn't leave quietly. After the police departed, she lingered for a moment longer, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her eyes burned with indignation as she stared at Alex, as if daring them to say something, or maybe just trying to intimidate them further. When Alex met her gaze, attempting to remain calm and composed, Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "You think this is funny, don't you?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "But mark my words, you'll regret not taking our community rules seriously." Alex blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Regret? Over what? They hadn't done anything wrong besides moving into their own house. Still, they decided it was best not to engage further. The last thing they needed was another round of drama on what should have been a happy day. Instead, they turned back to their friends who were still standing nearby, watching the scene unfold with a mix of amusement and disbelief. "Can you believe this?" Alex muttered under their breath, shaking their head. One of their friends chuckled nervously. Honestly, I think she's just jealous because your place looks better than hers, he joked, trying to lighten the mood. Another friend chimed in. Yeah, maybe she wanted to live here herself but missed her chance. Everyone laughed, but deep down, Alex knew Karen wasn't acting out of jealousy. This was about control, her need to assert dominance over everyone else in the neighborhood. Despite the jokes and attempts to brush off the encounter, Alex couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in their stomach. Something about Karen's behavior felt personal. She hadn't just shown up to enforce random rules. She'd gone out of her way to make Alex feel unwelcome. Was it because they were new? Or was there something more to it? Whatever the reason, Alex knew they couldn't let this slide. They had worked too hard to buy this house, and they weren't about to let someone like Karen ruin it for them. After finishing the move-in process, carefully repositioning the moving truck, rearranging the furniture inside, and hiding the infamous red box behind a stack of books, Alex sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. Their friends had left earlier, promising to return later for a proper housewarming party once things were settled. For now, though, Alex was alone with their thoughts. And those thoughts were consumed by one question. What could they do to protect themselves from Karen's antics in the future? That's when inspiration struck. If Karen was so obsessed with rules and regulations, maybe Alex could use that against her. It was worth a shot, right? With renewed determination, Alex pulled out their laptop and began researching everything they could find about the Homeowners Association, HOA. Surely there had to be some kind of guideline or policy that applied to Karen's behavior. After all, storming onto someone's property uninvited and making baseless accusations didn't seem like the most neighborly thing to do. As Alex scrolled through page after page of HOA documents, they started to piece together a clearer picture of how the organization operated. There were rules about noise levels, parking restrictions, landscaping requirements, and even guidelines for holiday decorations. Some of them seemed reasonable enough, while others bordered on absurd. But then, buried deep within the fine print, Alex stumbled upon something that made their heart race. A section titled, Trespassing and Unauthorized Entry. According to the document, any homeowner or resident found guilty of entering another person's property without explicit permission could face disciplinary action. Repeat offenders risked being fined, or worse, evicted from the neighborhood altogether. Alex read the clause several times, ensuring they understood it correctly. Could this really work? Had Karen technically trespassed earlier that day when she marched onto their driveway and started inspecting their belongings? It certainly seemed plausible. Excited by the possibility, Alex decided to dig deeper. They reached out to a few friends online who had experience dealing with difficult neighbors and HOA disputes. One of them suggested gathering evidence, photos, videos, witness statements, to build a solid case. Another recommended documenting every interaction with Karen, no matter how minor, to create a paper trail. Armed with this advice, Alex spent the rest of the evening strategizing. The next morning, Alex woke up early and got to work. First, they reviewed the photos and videos they'd taken during the move-in process. Sure enough, there were clear shots of Karen standing on their driveway, clipboard in hand, glaring at the movers. They also reached out to the friends who had helped them move, asking if they'd be willing to provide written statements detailing what they'd witnessed. To Alex's relief, everyone agreed enthusiastically. "Don't worry," one of them texted. "We've got your back." With the evidence compiled, Alex drafted a formal complaint and submitted it to the HOA board. In the letter, they outlined Karen's behavior step by step, attaching copies of the photos, videos, and witness statements to support their claims. They concluded by requesting an immediate hearing to address the issue and emphasized their desire to resolve the matter peacefully for the sake of maintaining harmony in the neighborhood. Submitting the complaint felt like a weight lifted off Alex's shoulders. Finally, they were taking action instead of sitting back and letting Karen dictate the terms. But as satisfying as it was to send off the letter, Alex knew this was only the beginning. The real challenge would come when they faced Karen directly, and that thought sent a shiver down their spine. Over the next few days, Alex kept a close eye on Karen's movements, She seemed to be lying low, avoiding their street altogether. At first, Alex wondered if she'd gotten wind of the complaint and decided to back off. But deep down, they knew better. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. More likely, she was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Sure enough, it didn't take long for her to resurface. One afternoon, as Alex was watering the plants in their front yard, they spotted Karen lingering near the edge of their property. She wasn't on the driveway this time. She was careful to stay on the sidewalk, but her eyes darted toward the house frequently, as if calculating her next move. Alex watched her warily, wondering what she was up to now. When Karen finally approached, she did so cautiously, as though testing the waters. "I hope you're planning to fix that fence soon," she said pointedly, gesturing toward a section of the backyard boundary that was slightly crooked. "It's an eyesore, and it doesn't comply with our standards." Alex forced a polite smile, refusing to rise to the bait. "Thanks for letting me know," they replied evenly. "I'll look into it." Inside, however, they were seething. Fix the fence, really? Of all the things to nitpick about, this was what she chose to focus on? Karen lingered for a few more minutes, making idle comments about the color of the curtains or the placement of the mailbox, before finally walking away. But Alex noticed something telling. She never once stepped onto their property. It was almost as if she knew she was being watched and judged. That night, as Alex lay in bed replaying the day's events in their mind, they realized something important. Karen was scared. Scared of getting caught. Scared of losing her grip on the neighborhood. Scared of being exposed for the bully she truly was. And Alex? Well, Alex had just discovered their secret weapon. Patience. Because sooner or later, Karen's fear would drive her to make a mistake. And when that happened, Alex would be ready. The days leading up to the HOA hearing were a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation for Alex. They knew this meeting would be pivotal, not just for their own peace of mind, but also for setting boundaries with Karen once and for all. If they played their cards right, they could turn the tables on her behavior and send a clear message. No one gets away with bullying or overstepping in this neighborhood. Alex spent hours fine-tuning their case, ensuring every detail was meticulously documented. They organized the evidence into categories: photos, videos, written statements from friends, and created a timeline of events to present during the hearing. It wasn't enough to simply accuse Karen of wrongdoing. Alex needed to prove it beyond any doubt. The more thorough they were, the harder it would be for Karen to wriggle out of responsibility. One evening, as Alex sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by papers and sticky notes, they couldn't help but reflect on how absurd the situation had become. Who would have thought that moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood could spiral into such drama? But there was also a sense of empowerment in knowing they weren't backing down. This wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. And if Karen wanted to play hardball, Alex was ready to step up to the plate. The day of the hearing arrived, and Alex felt a mix of nerves and determination. Dressed in clean, professional attire, they walked into the community center where the HOA meetings were held. The room was set up like a small courtroom, with rows of chairs facing a long table where the board members sat. At the far end of the room, Karen was already seated, flanked by two of her usual allies, who nodded encouragingly whenever she spoke. Her expression was smug, almost triumphant, as though she believed she'd already won before the proceedings even began. When Alex entered, Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, and she leaned over to whisper something to her companions. Whatever it was, it elicited quiet laughter. Alex ignored them, choosing instead to focus on the task ahead. Taking a seat near the front, they took a deep breath and reminded themselves why they were here: to stand up for what was right. The meeting started promptly, with Margaret, the no-nonsense retiree who served as HOA president, calling everyone to order. She introduced the agenda and explained that today's discussion would revolve around complaints filed by both parties involved. First up was Karen, who wasted no time launching into her version of events. "I'm only doing this because I care about our community," Karen began, her tone dripping with self-righteousness. "When new residents move in, It's important that they understand and respect our rules. Unfortunately, my attempts to guide Alex were met with hostility and disregard. Not only did they ignore my concerns, but they also accused me of harassment, a completely fabricated claim designed to deflect attention from their own violations. As Karen continued speaking, Alex listened intently, taking mental notes of her arguments. She painted herself as the victim, framing her actions as noble efforts to maintain order while portraying Alex as an unruly newcomer intent on disrupting the neighborhood harmony. To anyone unfamiliar with the truth, her story might have sounded convincing. But Alex knew better. Every word out of her mouth was carefully crafted to manipulate perceptions, and Alex was prepared to dismantle it piece by piece. When it was Alex's turn to speak, they approached the podium calmly, exuding confidence despite the weight of the moment. "Thank you for allowing me to address the board today," they began, their voice steady and measured. "I moved into this neighborhood hoping to build a home and contribute positively to the community. Unfortunately, my experience so far has been marred by repeated confrontations initiated by Mrs. Karen." Alex then launched into their presentation, starting with the incident on move-in day. Using the photos and videos they'd gathered, they showed the board exactly what had happened. There was Karen striding confidently onto their driveway, clipboard in hand, pointing at the moving truck and furniture. There was her face, contorted with frustration, as she called the police. And finally, there were screenshots of text messages, exchanged between them after the fact, where Karen admitted to reporting Alex to authorities. "This is not about enforcing rules," Alex emphasized, pausing for effect. "This is about trespassing. According to Section 4.2 of the HOA bylaws, unauthorized entry onto another homeowner's property without explicit permission constitutes a violation punishable by disciplinary action, including eviction for repeat offenses." The room fell silent as Alex handed copies of the relevant pages from the handbook to each board member. Margaret scanned the document closely, her brow furrowing slightly. Even Karen seemed momentarily thrown off balance, though she quickly recovered her composure. Karen tried to counter Alex's points, insisting that she had only been inspecting potential violations and hadn't technically trespassed since most of her comments were made from the sidewalk. But Alex anticipated this defense and responded swiftly. "While Mrs. Karen may argue semantics, the reality is that she repeatedly entered my property without invitation or consent, whether it was stepping onto my driveway or inspecting items inside my open doorway. These actions clearly fall under the definition of trespassing outlined in our guidelines." To drive the point home, Alex presented the witness statements from their friends who had helped with the move. Each statement corroborated Alex's account, describing Karen's aggressive demeanor and intrusive behavior. One friend wrote, "She acted as though she owned the place, making demands and refusing to leave until the police arrived." Another added, "It felt like we were being interrogated rather than welcomed." By the time Alex finished presenting their case, the atmosphere in the room had shifted noticeably. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful yet stern. Margaret leaned forward, addressing Karen directly. "Mrs. Karen, do you have anything further to add?" she asked, her tone leaving little room for evasion. Karen hesitated, visibly struggling to find a rebuttal. When she finally spoke, her words lacked conviction. "I was simply trying to protect the integrity of our neighborhood," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. "If Alex chooses to misinterpret my intentions, that's on them." Margaret sighed deeply, shaking her head. "This isn't about intentions," she said firmly. "It's about respect. For our rules, for each other, and for private property. What you did goes beyond enforcement. You trespassed and you caused unnecessary conflict. That's unacceptable." With those words, the verdict became inevitable. After a brief deliberation, the board announced its decision. Karen would receive a formal warning and be required to issue a written apology to Alex. Furthermore, any future infractions, especially involving trespassing or harassment, would result in immediate eviction proceedings. The ruling sent shockwaves through the room. Karen's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Alex felt a surge of vindication wash over them. Justice had been served, at least for now, as Karen stormed out of the room, muttering angrily under her breath. Alex allowed themselves a small smile. They had stood their ground, fought back against unfair treatment, and emerged victorious. But as satisfying as the outcome was, Alex knew this wasn't the end of the story. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully. No matter how decisive, the board's ruling, she would find ways to push back, subtle or otherwise. And Alex was ready. They had learned valuable lessons about standing up for themselves and navigating tricky situations. More importantly, they had discovered their own strength. As they left the community center that evening, Alex couldn't help but feel hopeful. Moving into a new home was supposed to be a fresh start, and despite the challenges they'd faced, they were determined to make the most of it. With Karen temporarily subdued and the HOA board on their side, Alex finally felt like they could breathe easy. For the first time since moving in, the future looked bright and full of possibilities. The weeks following the HOA hearing were a strange blend of relief and tension for Alex. On the surface, things seemed quieter. Karen kept her distance, no longer marching onto their driveway or scrutinizing every detail of their home. For the first time since moving in, Alex felt like they could unpack boxes and arrange furniture without worrying about an unexpected visit from their overzealous neighbor. But beneath this newfound calm, there was an undercurrent of unease. Alex knew Karen too well by now to believe she'd simply given up. This wasn't a woman who accepted defeat gracefully. It was only a matter of time before she tried something else, and sure enough, Karen didn't stay silent for long. At first, her tactics were subtle, almost unnoticeable. She started showing up at odd hours, lingering near the edge of Alex's property line as though casually taking a walk. Her eyes darted toward the house frequently, scanning for anything she could nitpick about. Sometimes, she'd stop to inspect the fence or comment on the placement of outdoor decorations when Alex happened to be outside. "You might want to fix that sooner rather than later," she'd say with a tight-lipped smile, pointing out minor imperfections that barely registered to anyone else. Alex handled these encounters with practiced patience. They nodded politely, thanked her for her input, and then went back to whatever they were doing. Inside, however, they bristled with frustration. It was clear Karen was testing the waters, looking for loopholes or weaknesses in the HOA ruling. Every interaction left Alex feeling more determined not to let her win. Not again. One evening, as Alex sat on their porch enjoying the cool breeze, they spotted Karen pacing along the sidewalk across the street. She wasn't close enough to technically trespass, but her behavior was unmistakably deliberate. She glanced toward Alex's yard repeatedly, muttering to herself as if rehearsing some grand plan. Something about her demeanor set off alarm bells in Alex's mind. This wasn't just idle wandering. Karen was plotting her next move. Over the next few days, Alex decided to take proactive steps. If Karen was going to continue pushing boundaries, Alex needed to document everything. They began carrying their phone everywhere, ready to record video or snap photos whenever Karen made an appearance. Friends who visited often joked that Alex had become a neighborhood detective, always alert and prepared for whatever might come next. But Alex didn't mind the teasing. They knew how important it was to stay vigilant. Then came the moment Alex had been dreading and secretly anticipating. One sunny afternoon, while watering the newly planted flowers in their front yard, Alex noticed Karen stepping onto their grass. Not just near the edge where one could argue she was still on public land, but fully onto the lawn. There was no mistaking it this time. Karen had crossed the line. Alex froze for a split second, caught between disbelief and triumph. Part of them couldn't believe Karen would actually do something so blatant after the HOA's warning. Another part, however, felt a surge of vindication. Finally, Karen had given them the evidence they needed to shut her down once and for all. Without hesitating, Alex pulled out their phone and started recording. They zoomed in on Karen's feet, clearly visible against the green grass, and captured her movements as she walked around the yard. When Karen realized she was being filmed, she stopped abruptly, her face flushing red. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp with irritation. "I'm documenting your actions," Alex replied calmly, keeping the camera steady. "You're trespassing, Mrs. Karen." Again. For a moment, Karen looked like she might deny it. Her mouth opened, then closed as though searching for the right words. But there was no denying what the video showed. Instead, she huffed loudly and stepped back onto the sidewalk, glaring daggers at Alex. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "All I was doing was checking for potential violations. Someone has to keep this place in order." Alex resisted the urge to laugh. Checking for violations? On private property? The audacity was almost impressive. "I appreciate your concern," they said dryly, lowering their phone but keeping it within reach. "But next time, maybe send an email instead of walking onto my lawn." Karen didn't respond. She spun around and marched off, her shoulders stiff with indignation. Alex watched her go, feeling a mix of satisfaction and resolve. They had her now, on video no less. This time, there would be no room for excuses or manipulation. That evening, Alex filed another formal complaint with the HOA board. Alongside the written report, they attached the video footage of Karen's latest trespassing incident. In their submission, they emphasized that this was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern of behavior that violated both the letter and spirit of the community guidelines. They requested immediate action, citing the board's previous ruling and reminding them of the consequences outlined in the bylaws. When the day of the second hearing arrived, Alex entered the community center with confidence. They had done everything right, gathered irrefutable evidence, followed proper procedures, and remained respectful throughout. Even if Karen tried to twist the narrative, the facts spoke for themselves. As Alex took their seat, they noticed Karen, sitting across the room, flanked by her usual supporters. Unlike last time, however, her expression was tense, her lips pressed into a thin line. She avoided making eye contact with Alex, focusing instead on shuffling papers nervously. The meeting began with Margaret calling everyone to order. After briefly summarizing the events leading up to this point, she turned to Karen. "Mrs. Karen, we've reviewed the materials submitted by both parties, including the video provided by Mr. Alex. Would you care to address the allegations?" Karen cleared her throat, visibly uncomfortable. "As I've said before, I'm only trying to ensure our neighborhood maintains its standards," she began, her tone defensive. "If I happened to step onto Mr. Alex's property, it was purely accidental, a momentary oversight. Surely we can agree that such a minor infraction doesn't warrant drastic measures." Her argument might have held water if it weren't for the mounting evidence against her. Alex waited patiently for his turn to speak, knowing the truth would speak, louder than any excuse Karen could concoct. When Margaret gestured for him to proceed, Alex stood up and approached the podium. "Accidental or not, Mrs. Karen's actions constitute trespassing," Alex stated firmly, projecting their voice so it carried through the room. "This isn't the first time she's crossed this boundary, nor is it the first time she's used enforcing rules as a justification for intruding on private property. The HOA board issued a clear warning during our last meeting. Any further infractions would result in eviction proceedings. Today we're here because Mrs. Karen chose to ignore that warning." Alex played the video for the board, pausing occasionally to highlight key moments. The footage left little room for interpretation. Karen's feet were plainly visible on Alex's grass, and her comments about checking for violations were audible enough to dispel any claims of innocence. As the clip ended, the room fell silent. Even Karen's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to defend her this time. Margaret leaned forward, addressing Karen directly. "Mrs. Karen, you were explicitly warned about the consequences of repeating this behavior, yet here we are, reviewing yet another incident involving unauthorized entry onto private property. How do you respond?" Karen stammered, struggling to find a plausible explanation. I never intended to cause trouble," she managed finally, her voice wavering. "I thought I was acting in the best interest of the community." "That may be true," Margaret replied, her tone firm but fair. "However, intentions don't negate actions. Our rules exist to protect everyone equally, including homeowners' rights to privacy and peace. Repeatedly violating those rights undermines the very foundation of our association. With that, the board convened briefly to discuss their decision. When they returned, Margaret delivered the verdict. Karen's membership in the HOA would be terminated effective immediately, and she would be required to vacate the neighborhood within 30 days. Any attempt to appeal the decision would require overwhelming new evidence, a bar set intentionally high to prevent further disruption. The room erupted into murmurs as Karen sat frozen in her chair, her face pale with shock. For once, she was speechless. Alex, meanwhile, felt a wave of relief wash over them. It was over. After months of stress and uncertainty, justice had been served. Karen wouldn't be able to torment them or anyone else in the neighborhood anymore. As the meeting adjourned, Alex packed up their materials and headed outside. The air felt lighter somehow, as though a dark cloud had lifted. Neighbors who had previously kept their distance now greeted Alex warmly, congratulating them on standing up to Karen. Some even admitted they'd been intimidated by her antics in the past, but were glad someone had finally put a stop to it. Driving home, Alex reflected on everything they'd been through. Moving into a new house was supposed to mark a fresh start, and while the journey had been far bumpier than expected, it had also taught them valuable lessons about resilience, patience, and the importance of standing up for oneself. Most importantly, it reminded them that sometimes fighting back wasn't just necessary, it was empowering. Back at home, Alex poured themselves a celebratory drink and stepped onto the porch. The sun was setting, casting golden hues across the eye. The days following the HOA's decision were surreal for Alex. It was as though a heavy weight had been lifted from their shoulders, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of calm and satisfaction. For months, Karen had loomed over their life like a storm cloud, casting shadows on what should have been a joyful chapter. But now, with her eviction looming, Alex finally felt free to breathe easy. They could walk outside without glancing nervously down the street or wondering if she'd appear out of nowhere to criticize something trivial. The relief was palpable. Still, Alex couldn't help but feel a twinge of curiosity about how Karen would handle the fallout. Would she put up a fight? Try to rally support from other neighbors? Or would she quietly pack her things and disappear, leaving behind only memories of her infamous behavior? Whatever her next move, Alex knew they wouldn't be surprised. After all, Karen wasn't someone who gave up easily, even when faced with overwhelming evidence against her. It didn't take long for Karen to make her presence known again. Over the next week, she became increasingly visible around the neighborhood, almost as if she were staging a last-ditch effort to reclaim her reputation, or perhaps just stir up trouble before departing. She knocked on doors, inviting herself into conversations with other residents and claiming that Alex had targeted her unfairly. According to Karen, the entire situation was a personal vendetta orchestrated by someone who didn't understand the importance of maintaining community standards. At first, some neighbors seemed sympathetic to her plight. After all, Karen had always been vocal about her love for the neighborhood, even if her methods were often overbearing. But Alex wasn't worried. They trusted that the truth would prevail, especially since most people in the area had witnessed snippets of Karen's behavior firsthand, whether it was her habit of policing minor details or her tendency to escalate conflicts unnecessarily. Many residents harbored quiet frustrations with her antics. Now, with concrete proof of her trespassing and harassment, those frustrations were bubbling to the surface. One afternoon, while Alex was tending to their garden, a neighbor named Sarah stopped by to chat. Sarah lived 2 houses down and had occasionally nodded hello during walks but never ventured beyond polite small talk. Today, however, she lingered longer than usual, leaning against the fence with a thoughtful expression. "I heard about what happened at the hearing," Sarah began cautiously. "I just wanted to say, and I think you did the right thing. Karen can be, well, let's just say she doesn't always know when to stop." Alex smiled, touched by the unexpected support. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot. Honestly, I didn't want it to come to this, but sometimes enough is enough, you know." Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "Absolutely. We've all dealt with her at one point or another. It's exhausting. You standing your ground might actually inspire others to speak up too. Their conversation ended on a positive note, leaving Alex feeling hopeful. If nothing else, maybe this ordeal would encourage more open communication within the neighborhood. Perhaps Karen's departure would create space for healthier relationships among residents, fostering a stronger sense of community instead of fear and resentment. As the deadline for Karen's eviction approached, signs of her impending departure became impossible to ignore. Her house, once meticulously maintained, started showing signs of neglect. Flower beds grew wild and the lawn turned brown where it hadn't been watered. Boxes piled up near the front door, spilling out onto the porch. Even her car, usually gleaming and spotless, now sported a thin layer of dust. It was as though Karen had given up, not just on fighting the ruling, but on caring about appearances altogether. Then came the day the moving truck arrived. Neighbors gathered discreetly behind curtains and fences, watching as workers loaded furniture and boxes into the vehicle. Karen herself remained largely out of sight, emerging only briefly to oversee the process. Gone was the confident, self-assured woman who had once strutted through the streets like she owned the place. In her place stood someone visibly defeated, shoulders slumped and face drawn tight with exhaustion. When the truck finally pulled away, taking Karen's belongings, and presumably Karen herself with it, the neighborhood exhaled collectively. Some residents cheered quietly, others exchanged knowing looks. A few even waved goodbye sarcastically as the truck disappeared down the road. Though no one said it aloud, the sentiment was clear. Good riddance. For Alex, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, they were thrilled to see the source of so much stress leave their life for good. On the other hand, they couldn't deny feeling a pang of empathy. No matter how difficult Karen had been, Alex recognized that losing one's home must be devastating. Still, they reminded themselves that Karen had brought this outcome upon herself through repeated violations of both rules and basic decency. Justice had been served, and there was comfort in that knowledge. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly transformed. Without Karen's constant scrutiny, people began relaxing in ways they hadn't before. Lawn ornaments appeared. In yards, painted vibrant colors that clashed beautifully with the natural surroundings. Music drifted through open windows. Laughter echoed along sidewalks, and neighbors greeted each other with genuine warmth rather than wary politeness. It was as though the entire community had been holding its breath for years, and now, finally, everyone could exhale. Alex embraced the change wholeheartedly. They hosted a belated housewarming party, inviting everyone on the block to celebrate not just their new home, but the fresh start they all seemed to share. To their delight, nearly every invitation was accepted. Friends brought food, drinks, and stories about past encounters with Karen, turning the evening into a light-hearted roast session. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the scent of grilled burgers and freshly cut grass. For the first time, Alex truly felt like part of the community. One guest, an older man named Tom, raised his glass during a toast and offered words that resonated deeply with everyone present. "Here's to new beginnings," he said, his voice warm and steady. "And here's to standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Alex showed us all that we don't have to tolerate nonsense, and because of that, our neighborhood is better off today than it was yesterday. The room erupted in applause, and Alex felt a lump rise in their throat. They hadn't set out to become a hero or a role model. They'd simply wanted to protect their peace and happiness. Yet somehow, their actions had sparked a ripple effect, inspiring others to embrace kindness and cooperation over control and conflict. Life settled into a rhythm after that. Days stretched lazily into evenings filled with friendly chats across fences and spontaneous gatherings on porches. Alex planted more flowers in their garden, adding splashes of color that caught the sunlight perfectly. They joined the local book club, volunteered at the annual block party, and even helped organize a neighborhood cleanup initiative. Each activity brought them closer to their goal of building a life rooted in connection and joy. Looking back, Alex realized how much they'd grown throughout the experience. Moving into a new home had tested their patience, resilience, and courage in ways they never anticipated. But it had also taught them invaluable lessons about boundaries, assertiveness, and the power of standing up for oneself. Most importantly, it reinforced their belief that fairness and respect should be non-negotiable pillars of any community. On quiet nights, as Alex sat on their porch watching fireflies dance in the twilight, they allowed themselves to reflect on everything they might overcome. From the chaos of move-in day to the final departure of their least favorite neighbor, the journey had been anything but smooth. Yet here they were, happier, stronger, and surrounded by people who genuinely cared about one another. In the end, Alex understood that life rarely went according to plan. Challenges arose when least expected, testing limits and reshaping perspectives. But with determination, support, and a willingness to fight for what mattered most, even the toughest battles could lead to beautiful outcomes. And as far as Alex was concerned, their little corner of the world was finally exactly where it needed to be: peaceful, welcoming, and full of promise.